Hello everyone, we are the group 4 and today we are going to discuss the lesson about the process in developing and using rubrics for alternative assessment. But before that, let us have a quick recap based on the lesson we had last time. Previously, the Group 3 reporters discussed the lesson about portfolio assessment and its significance in the teaching learning process. They also defined the meaning of portfolio assessment and able to deliver the implications on why portfolio assessment is important and useful. And most importantly, they taught us the steps or the detailed process on how to do or make a portfolio assessment. So, in this particular lesson, you are expected to develop appropriate rubrics to assess students' performance and outputs, and use rubrics to assess students' performance and output. And for us to be properly guided, here are the guidelines. Number 1. What is rubric? Number 2. What are the different types of rubric? Number 3. What are the characteristics of a good rubric? Number 4. What are the basic steps in developing rubrics? And number 5. How can you make rubric useful to your students? So then, these questions will be answered as we dive deeper on this formal discussion. But before we start with a formal discussion, let us learn that at the end of this particular lesson, you should be able to demonstrate your knowledge and skills in developing rubrics that are most applicable to a student performance and output. So, the following indicators will help you determine if you are successful in developing rubrics. So, as you can see in the table that is displayed, there are two columns, which are the tasks and the success indicators. So, for the tasks, it states that developing rubrics for students' performance and outputs. And in the success indicators, it come up with assessment rubrics containing the essential features of a sound rubric. To get started, it is important to review your prior knowledge on the difference between traditional and authentic assessment and how and when to choose a particular assessment tool that is most appropriate in measuring the learning or instructional objectives and intended learning outcomes of your subject. To move further, let us know first the meaning of a rubric. So, what is a rubric? A rubric is an assessment tool that specifies the performance expectations for any kind of student work, particularly those that are not traditional in nature, such as portfolio, outputs or projects, performances, collaborative work, and research. In other words, A rubric is typically an evaluation tool or set of guidelines used to promote the consistent application of learning expectations, learning objectives, or learning standards within the classroom, or simply means to measure their attainment against a consistent set of criteria. So there are three essential features of rubric. Number one, criteria or the aspects of performance that will be assessed. Number two, descriptors or the characteristics associated with each criterion. Number three, performance levels that identify students' level of mastery within each criterion. To prevent confusion about the elements of rubric, we can see below the specific terms. So the following are examples of student performances and outputs that can be assessed by a rubric. Number 1. Oral presentations or demonstrations. Specifically, research paper or poster presentation, individual or group report, skills demonstration such as baking and teaching, and lastly, the extemporaneous speech. These are the four oral presentations, and I am sure that we are all familiar with these activities. Moreover, if you might ask the difference between extemporaneous and impromptu speech, when we say extemporaneous speech, it is done with careful preparation, while in impromptu speech, it is done without even a glimpse of preparation. So, all in all, they are both informative with accordance to its context or topic. So, in number two, it entails dramatic or creative performances, and it has dance recital, performance in a play or musicals, poetry reading and interpretation, and lastly, playing musical instruments. So these performances used our cognitive, affective, and kinesthetic skills. Number three, which is public speaking, and it has debates, declamation, panel discussion, and inspirational speech. So these activities require confidence and must have a mastery of language used. And number four, the athletic skills demonstration or competition. So the second one talks about products or outputs. Number one, visual products, which has paintings, collages, posters, and video presentations. Number two, which is kinesthetic products, and it has diorama, sculpture, dance recital, and wood carvings. In number three, the written products, which are essays, poems, thesis or term paper, and movie or TV script. And lastly, the verbal products, which are audio tapes, voice recording, and speech scripts, which either to inform or to persuade, and the like. So, what are the different types of rubric? Beforehand, rubrics are classified with these aspects. The first is whether the rubric considers each of the criteria one at a time or all criteria together. Number two, whether the rubric is applicable to all similar tasks or can only be used for a particular task. So, to understand more the aspects of rubrics, here are the types of rubrics. The first one is the general or generic rubric. It contains criteria that are general and can be applied across tasks. This is most convenient for teachers who do not have the time and skills in developing different types of rubric, as they can reuse the same rubrics for several tasks or assignments. However, the teacher may not be able to assess accurately the student's performance for a particular task. For example, the same rubric that can be used to evaluate both oral presentation and research output. So here is the example of a general or generic rubric. So the second type of rubric is called task-specific rubric. It contains criteria that are unique to a specific performance task to be assessed. This kind of rubric is best for instruction and formative assessment since it will provide the students feedback on what aspects of their performance or work that is need to be improved. However, developing analytic rubrics is time consuming for teachers. For example, a rubric can only be used for oral presentation and another rubric is applicable for research output. So in other words, task-specific rubric is an opposite of a general or generic rubric. So the attached photos is is an example of a task-specific rubric. Oops. So the third type of rubrics is called holistic rubric. A student's performance or output is evaluated by applying all criteria simultaneously, thus providing a single score based on an overall judgment about the quality of students' work. It does not provide a score on each individual criterion. So one advantage of holistic rubric is that it is quick to develop and use by the teachers. However, it does not inform students about their specific strengths and weaknesses, and thus may not be as sufficient and helpful in guiding them in improving their performance. For example, a rubric for problem-solving activities which entails scoring the student's overall ability to solve a particular problem or issue, and a rubric for creative work, example painting, which gives an overall score for the student's creativity and skill. So the attached photo is an example of a holistic rubric. And the last but not the least type of rubric is called analytic rubric. A student's work is evaluated by using each criterion separately, thus providing specific feedback about a student's performance or product along several dimensions. This is most applicable for assessing a complex performance or product. One advantage is it one advantage is it identifies the student's strengths and areas for improvement based on the criteria identified. Scoring with an analytic rubric, however, would entail more time than with a holistic rubric. For example, a rubric for research paper that requires scoring a student's work on different parts of the research paper, or a rubric for chemical laboratory experiment taking into consideration the student's performance in every stage of the experiment. So to concretize, the attached photos is an example of an analytic rubric.